Welcome back to Burn the Haystack with Josh and Jesse.
I'm Jesse.
And I'm Josh.
And this is a podcast all about saving the best and burning the rest. I know you really wanted me to follow you there with a song, but I'm sorry, I'm not going to do that.
My expectations were high, and now my disappointment is high as well. So thanks, Jesse. No, I'm kidding. No, it's fine.
I'm so sorry.
No, I've got a song. Today it's warmed up again in Sydney. I'm looking outside. There's sheep for some reason, and it's just a good day. But it's not just a good day because of the weather. It's a good day because we've got good company today.
That's so true. We are very, very lucky to once again talk to friend of the show, Mr. Nathan Brown. Thank you very much for joining us, Nathan.
Cool, and I think they should be warned that last time I was a guest on this show was the week before it died. You killed it. After I was on the show, you took it out the back and you put it down. So that doesn't bode well for today.
Well, but luckily, last time we got some sort of, shock thing, and maybe it was the power of God that resurrected the show. So there's always hope. Even if it does die, it will rise again. That's not foreshadowing, I hope. But anyway.
I like to think that the show wasn't dead. It was just having a well-deserved nap. A long nap.
I still took it somewhat personally that you felt, either we've reached the pinnacle or we've reached the absolute depths that this is going to. Time to stop.
It's the sleep before the resurrection.
Wow. Very biblical.
Very good.
No, hey,
but good to be back.
It's great to have you, and I'm sorry if that's the perspective that we left. It was a great episode. Anybody who hasn't listened to it should definitely go back.
Yeah.
It's awesome, and so I'm glad to have you back. I guess before we get into the real nut meat of the podcast, I don't know. Hey, any updates that you want to share? Nathan, since last time you were on the show?
So late 2020. Nothing much has happened since then, has it? So since late 2020, well, there's probably a couple more books I can plug. And late last year put out a book that has some bearing on this particular discussion for today called A House on Fire, How Adventist Faith Responds to Race and Racism. And also across this year, I've actually done a podcast series which has been put out on Adventist Peace Radio and Adventist Voices concurrently. I should have talked to you guys as well. But interviewing a bunch of the really good people that contributed chapters to that book, and some really great discussions with some of those people, going deep into, how Adventist faith can respond to, recognizes, and actually then in the best of who we are can work on the big project of undoing racism in our world. And that's been a pretty exciting project that I've been working on now for, 3 years or so.
Wow. And if I could quickly shout out, I believe it was Adventist Record Live. You did a little bit of a spot I want to say a couple months ago. It may have been even less time than that. Talking through some of the themes of the book. So that's a good one to check out as well.
With my co-editor, Dr. Murray Jackson from La Sierra University, and he's just been a good man to work with on this project and had the opportunity to do all sorts of speaking in relation to that particular project, popping up on different places around, different Zoom calls and discussion meetings and things like that all around the world on that topic, because it has resonated quite, to be honest, I've been pleasantly surprised with how well the book has been received and sold and engaged with, and the discussions that have come off it has been really, really good.
So that's A House on Fire.
Yeah.
Nice.
Available now.
Yeah, I actually
where all good books are sold.
I was at a minister, we have a national pastors meeting. So all the pastors in Australia, we do it once every 5 years. And we had it at the beginning of this year, which was cool. And yeah, your book, I think they gave, well, I can't remember exactly how it worked, but I remember there was a lot of us, if not all of us, that got a free copy of your book and a couple others. And yeah, it was interesting even just hearing, like, it was cool seeing that sort of thing, like just being talked about amongst other pastors and having that as a conversational standpoint, because obviously like there's differing views. And but what I like about that book is just, I guess it is a lot of differing views. Like it's all these different essays from really insightful people, but I guess the way it all comes together, super interesting. So yeah, definitely would encourage people to check it out. Yeah, really challenging read, but in a good way, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's a difficult topic, and, you know, how do you talk about it? And yeah, and to some degree it grew out of conversations that Maury Jackson and myself were having already. And we said we need to do something about this, you know, beginning in late 2020 in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd and Black Lives Matter protests around the world and some of those things. But also that strong belief that actually at its best, Adventism and Adventist faith has something meaningful to contribute to those kind of discussions in the world. And one of the fascinating things that we've seen in the response to that book has been people beyond Adventism who have seen the value in, hey, this is a unique contribution to an important social issue, and both on personal levels, but even, you know, there are universities in different places that have some connection to the book, where in even one or two non-Adventist universities that are using this as readings in class, you know, for various things. So that's pretty cool to see that kind of engagement with it, and to be reminded that our faith, when we talk about things in the wider world, when we bring the best of our faith to them, we actually have something meaningful to contribute. And I think we need to be sometimes less focused on what we think we need to tell people and more, how can we draw from the best of our faith to make a contribution to things that people already care about and engaged with.
Yeah, that's good. Well, on that topic, I think this is the perfect opportunity to transition to our subject matter for the episode, and that, I mean, you'll have already read the title of the episode, so you know what you're getting yourself in for. We are talking about the voice to Parliament. Now, for our international crowd, which is quite a few burn the haystackers or haystack burners, or I don't know what we call our fans, but either way, this might be a little bit of an arcane thing. They might not quite understand, but those of us who are living, particularly in the South Pacific, Australia, obviously, this has sort of been an inescapable part of our lives for the better part of the last 6 months to a year, in terms of the news cycle, at least. And obviously, for many Indigenous Australians, this is this has been in their conscience for a long time, far longer than that. Now, we're not going to make any assumptions or claims here about your ability as a historian, Nathan. But I know that you do have a particular interest in this topic, and this is meant to be I suppose, a conversation for us to invite you in, dear listener, irrespective of where you fall on the political spectrum. And obviously, this has become an extremely politicized issue. There has been a lot of things said, a lot of ink spilled, a lot of TikTok video times wasted on varying viewpoints, some of them helpful, some of them not so much. But maybe it would be a helpful thing to start, Nathan, for you to tell us a little bit about, I suppose, where this is coming from, why there has been a perception of a need for a voice to Parliament. In other words, however you want to go about it, what has precipitated this, and why are we even having this conversation on the national stage at all?
And what is it for those overseas?
Yeah, that's a little question. Yeah. So firstly, the discussion that's happening right at the moment is the constitutional process that Australia has to go through if it wants to change its constitution, its founding document. The Constitution of Australia was drafted in the 1890s, and Australia became an independent nation in 1901. And since that time, or that document actually sets out the process by which you have to go through if you want to change it. And since that time, there's been 44 referenda held, and of those, only 8 have passed. So it's a difficult process, and it should be. A constitution is an important document. You don't want to make it that you can change it with the winds of the day, but you also want to make it that you can change it when it's necessary and when it is helpful to making the country a better place. So the process that it goes through is that it gets a suggested amendment gets voted through Parliament. Then it has to be put to a national vote, and that vote has to get a majority support of the entire Australian population, and then also majority support in a majority of the states of Australia. So there's 6 states in Australia, so a majority of people in 4 of the states have to vote for it as well. So that's the kind of double majority that is needed to get something like this through. In this particular context, and I can just drop in here, back in my days as a law student, because that is one of the backgrounds that I bring to this. 30 years ago, when I was a law student, there was a court case called Mabo versus the state of Queensland that was, for the first time, recognised legally that there had been Indigenous people living in Australia before European settlement or European colonisation. We all learnt in primary school in Australia that the first fleet arrived in Australia in 1788, and up until 1992, the legal assumption about everything, that underlied everything, including the Constitution, was that there weren't actually Indigenous people in Australia before then. Now, that's before 1788. Now, of course, that's not true. Nobody's arguing that, they arrived in 1803 or anything like that. But it's never been officially recognised. And so there has been this movement, particularly since 1992, and it was part of a referendum in 1999 as part of Australia voted on whether it should become a republic. But there was a second question in that referendum, which was, do we recognise our Indigenous people in the preamble to the Constitution? And that got voted no, based on the it's kind of lost within the referendum, sort of republic referendum debate. And so, but even that was under the prime ministership of John Howard, and he became, he kind of continued to have this interest in this project, and in 2007 he again committed to, this is something we really need to do as a nation. Now, there was a change of government, he didn't get around to doing that, and in 2010 there was a working group established to start working through what can we do with this, how can we recognise our Indigenous people. There was various processes that were worked through at that point, and another change of government, and in 2015 there was a meeting of some key Indigenous leaders, about 30 or 40 of them, with the then Prime Minister Tony Abbott and the opposition leader at the time, and they said, okay, we want to move forward with this, but how are we going to do it? And is one of the key questions that came out of that is that we don't just want a kind of symbolic recognition, we want there to be an actual functional mechanism that can not only recognise our Indigenous peoples, that they were here first and they have an ongoing custodianship of our land, but also that there would be a mechanism by which they could address some of the specific issues and continuing disadvantage that our Indigenous communities have. And there's some pretty significant things when you look at like the Closing the Gap reports that suggest that life expectancy for Australia's Indigenous people is more than 10 years less than the general population. Incarceration rates for our Indigenous people are 12 times higher than the general population. It's the highest incarceration rate of any people group in the world. And these are some of the chronic disadvantages that are, situations of disadvantage that are experienced by Indigenous people. So as a result of that meeting in 2015, there was a consultation process set up that there were 13 regional consultation groups that met over a period of time across the country over the following couple of years. And then in 2017, there was a constitutional convention that was convened with representatives of Indigenous peoples at Uluru in the centre of Australia. And that gave rise to the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which has kind of been the document that then continued to say, well, how do we recognise our Indigenous peoples in a meaningful way? And so that's the document that has now led, after quite a few other review processes and working groups and parliamentary committees and Senate inquiries and all of these things, and another change of government that have led us to the referendum today. And so one of the key things when we get to actually looking at what the referendum question is simply that the question there is drawn from a single sentence of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. So we get distracted, even some of the debate has been distracted about, what is the Uluru Statement from the Heart and how big is it and all these things. We're not even voting on the Uluru Statement from the Heart. We're voting on one sentence within it, which simply says, we ask to be recognised by the people of Australia by the mechanism of a voice to Parliament. And that's where we've got to.
Wow. That was an extensive history. Thank you. That was really good. I was amazed. You said that like all off the top of your head. It's amazing.
I've bored you into silence.
I'm like, that was awesome. I was like, wow, you just like shot through all of that. That was so good. Yeah. Cool. So just to clarify again for our overseas listeners, and I guess maybe some of our local listeners who maybe haven't been paying as much attention, which is fine. I get it. We're all busy. So at the moment, there's going to be a referendum, which is like a national vote all around Australia, and we're voting on a particular change to the Constitution, which, like you said, it's a big deal. It's only happened, did you say 43 times? 44 times?
44. We've voted on 44 questions. Yep. Some referendums have had multiple questions to talk about, but there's been 44 attempted amendments to the Constitution, and 8 of them have passed in the previous one.
Pretty low pass rate, which, it's interesting.
It's a difficult thing to do.
I mean, like trying to rally. I mean, it's hard enough to get a small group of people to change something, let alone getting a whole country to change something. So it makes sense.
Well, and interestingly, in the history of it, one of those that passed was recognising Indigenous people as part of the Constitution in 1967. And that more than 90% of the Australian population voted for that at that time. And that was because previously the Constitution had actually said that Indigenous people weren't included in the modern Australian nation. And there was a couple of provisions where it basically said the federal government is not allowed to make laws that affect Indigenous people. And that was taken out. And, kind of the assumption behind the Constitution as it was drafted in the 1890s is that Indigenous peoples were not going to be part of modern Australia. It's the kind of the assumption of colonisation that you will either assimilate or you'll be exterminated. And even the language that was used in the early 20th century was talking about, the care or the protection, to use that in inverted quotes, was basically about, and this is language that was used in the documents of the day, to smooth the pillow of a dying race, and that they would die out. And that was government policy effectively for at least the first half of the 20th century. And so when we got to 1967, we had to say, well, actually, our Indigenous people are here, and they're still here, and so there are some things that we need to coordinate and recognise them in some different ways. But still, it actually means that where there were some negative statements about Indigenous people in the original Constitution, now there are no statements about Indigenous people in the Constitution. And so the actual proposed amendment is to add a new section to the Constitution that will recognise Indigenous people as the First Nations of Australia, and then to set up this mechanism subject to Parliament and for the Parliament to have the power to set up this mechanism to have that kind of consultative body that would represent and give advice on Indigenous issues.
Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned that, Nathan, because I think most of us probably don't really think about the fact that the White Australia policy existed and that it was very real. I feel very privileged that as a young kid, my parents thought it was appropriate to show me the Rabbit Proof Fence film. Materials like that, which really, I think, especially in our cultural moment that we're in right now, we're kind of at a point where any pointing out of racism or any of these things that are negative that we've done in the past is kind of like, it's met with a lot of resistance. Like, how dare you make me feel bad for something my ancestors did, or whatever the case may be. And that's a feature of many of our race relations conversations all around the world, not just here in Australia. Yeah. I want to just quickly drill down on the mechanism that is being proposed to be set up, because I think there's also an assumption that this is something special and unique that only Indigenous people are going to be able to speak to parliamentarians in this context. But I think the vast majority probably might assume that that's the case. But would you be able to kind of take us through who has a voice to Parliament currently, like in terms of the people in Australia, or the corporations, or the associations, or whatever? This mechanism that is being proposed to be set up, is this unique, or are there already people or entities in our country that are kind of doing what is being proposed to be done, but representing their own people?
Yeah. I mean, there's not a lot of them that I can name off the top of my head, but there are actually consultative mechanisms like this that are already in place for lots of different issues and industries and focus groups and special interests. Just as one very generic example, we have an organisation in Australia called the Productivity Commission. And it's basically a government-supported think tank, a group of people that are employed to give advice to the government on how to make the economy of Australia more productive. And sometimes they will commission reports that they'll give to government and say, here's an idea. Sometimes the government will go to them and say, hey, we've got a question. What if we did this? What do you think the outcome of this would be? And so there are organisations like that, like the Human Rights Commission, like so many other advisory bodies that the government has all around it, but that are often very focused on a particular topic or issue, and there are hundreds of them. That's the way our government works effectively. And so I think that this is actually not a new idea. I think it's also not a new idea because a lot of other organisations already have Indigenous voices mechanisms within them. The Seventh-day Adventist Church is one. We have the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Ministries that is focused on particularly on ministering to Indigenous people. We run a Bible college that is set up to support and particularly train Indigenous pastors. We have these special kind of focus on a group with special needs. And at times the ATSIM leadership will advise the leadership of the church on how do we respond to this in a way that is sensitive towards our Indigenous peoples? How do we, how can we, so this is a mechanism that is recognised in many different, the National Rugby League has an Indigenous voice organisation within it. So a lot of organisations see the value of it. A lot of government areas of special interest within government have those kind of advisory bodies already set up. And for those that argue that, it's wrong to treat people differently for different needs, are they the people that are protesting about the small percentage of people that actually need ramps to get into public buildings because they're in wheelchairs? Or do we recognise that actually to cater to people who need that extra access to get into that building is actually a really good thing? One of the challenges for Indigenous people in Australia is that they're only 3 to 4% of the population. And so, that's a very small group within the larger Australian society. And then take another step is that, and this was a study that I came across recently, only 17% of the non-Indigenous population of Australia have interacted socially with Indigenous people in the last year. And so the reality is that most Australians don't know an Indigenous person, and that's a really limited, so we need to, it's not even that all of us have those connections with Indigenous people, and I think some of us within the church actually have more opportunities because we recognise Indigenous people as a part of our family, and so we might interact with them in the context of, worship or church events or some of these kind of places. But most Australians don't have that privilege. And, this is why it's important for us to actually have very intentional mechanisms for us to be able to hear their voices.
Wow. Talk to us about you don't need to, define Webster's dictionary of an advisory body, but this is the thing that I think a lot of people get stuck on. What does it mean for some entity to be advisory? Because I think that this is potentially a sticking point for some people about the power that could potentially be leveraged and what it actually means for a voice to Parliament to consult on issues pertaining to Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders.
Yeah, so the first aspect of it is that it's actually sent out in the proposed amendment to the Constitution. And it talks about how Parliament has the authority to make a law, to set up an advisory body. This advisory body will then, in turn, advise Parliament on laws that relate to issues that affect Indigenous peoples, and that then this will be an ongoing part of, the Australian experience and how the Australian Parliament can actually do a better job at responding to the specific needs of this, chronically disadvantaged community, and also one that holds a special place in Australia's history as the first peoples of the land. And so, there's nothing wrong with treating people specially and getting special interest. Some of the anti-referendum or the no campaigning has been talking about, Indigenous people already get all these things given to them, which may or may not be true, certainly not in the ways that it has been portrayed by some. But the reality is that many people would agree that the system isn't working particularly well. And so this is an opportunity for Indigenous peoples to actually be given greater responsibility to direct some of these things. And the Indigenous people that I've had the opportunity to talk with and to work with in this context, it's about getting services to the level grassroots in communities where there are, just really significant issues around health and education and social fabrics and all of these things that really, that's the focus of this. And so not only is there this kind of a constitutional mandate that a government needs to prioritise this more than it has in the past, there is also a political pragmatic to it that I think, for all the different variations that have been given in relation to this, this discussion, is simply that the voice will have credibility as much as it addresses the key needs of its community, of its constituents. So when it's talking about issues like health and education and community well-being, then the government would be, the government has a kind of a imperative to actually listen. Because if they're giving good advice and setting out ideas for good programs and good interventions and, that's a loaded word, but good initiatives that can actually grow Indigenous communities and Indigenous well-being, then the government, of course, will listen to that. Because if they're good ideas, they should be listened to. But if they are starting to give advice on whether Australia should buy nuclear submarines, the government is quite entitled to ignore that. And to turn that around the other way, there's also a political imperative or pragmatic imperative there of if the government continues to ignore good advice from the Indigenous voice, then there's a political ramification to that. That's where one of the reasons that you might vote for a different government, so that they would actually do better on these topics. So this by setting it up in the Constitution, it creates a constitutional mandate for prioritising this at a better level. But at the same time, there's this political, pragmatic kind of reality to it all, that it's in everybody's interest to actually make this work as best as it possibly can for the issues that it is intended to address.
Yeah, I was watching a video about this recently.
You have to be careful what you watch.
No, I know, yeah. It sounds like... No, but it was just talking about how, like, why this should go... Like, why this needs to be constitutional rather than just, like, something that governments set up themselves, I guess. And they were saying it's sort of because they've tried to set this sort of thing up before, but it kind of keeps, like, rising and falling because of the governments surrounding it, I guess. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like what, like I guess the reason for this being, because I'm just thinking, like, if somebody is overseas, they might be thinking like an advisory body sounds like a great idea, but like why would it go like in a constitution? That seems like a massive deal.
Well, partly firstly and primarily, this is actually a process of recognition. And the mechanism is the process by which we do the recognition. So the recognition needs to be in the Constitution. And most of the politicians, whichever way they might be arguing, actually recognise the importance of recognition. But our Indigenous people then have specifically asked that the recognition take the form of a practical mechanism that can help some of the really significant issues that need to be addressed. So the first thing is simply because that is what our Indigenous people asked for. That's a really good reason for me to actually seriously consider that this isn't a political stunt. This has been something that's the longest running law reform process in the history of the Australian nation. And through that process, a broad consultation process and all these other reviews and inquiries and working groups and whatever, we've got to this point of a relatively simple request saying this is how we would like to do this better. And so that's one reason, is that's what's been asked for. But getting back to the history, in 2003 I interviewed a guy by the name of Lionel Quartermain, who was an Indigenous person from North Queensland and a Seventh-day Adventist church member, and he'd recently been elected as a commissioner for ATSIC, which was the government's advisory and administrative body for Indigenous people at that time. I interviewed him in 2003 for an article that was published in Adventist Record, and I recently went back and looked it up because it was actually 20 years ago this month. And he was talking about how important it was for there to be a voice to government to talk about these important issues of health and education and community well-being and all of these things. And that how he, as a Seventh-day Adventist and a person of faith, was, privileged to be able to represent his people in doing this, that he wanted to sit down with the government and really try and make some practical progress on this. At the time, he was the acting chairman of ATSIC, the acting national leader for ATSIC. Now, months later, ATSIC was abolished by the Howard government at the time. There had been some issues around ATSIC. The previous chairman that Lionel was acting as was acting chairman because the other guy was being investigated because of some really bad improprieties. And that kind of really tarnished the reputation of ATSIC. There were issues around it. There was complications with it. But Indigenous people that I talk to today actually look back at that saying that was when it was best for us, because there was a really centralised, organised body that was prioritising this in the government's thinking and was, we were really making some strides in addressing some of these things. It was convenient for the government of the day to simply abolish it rather than try and fix it. And so within months of this really great chat that I'd had with this guy who was seeking to lead it, and to lead it faithfully, something that he saw as a way he could serve his people and the Australian nation, and then it was gone, and there's been nothing like it since. So 20 years of kind of rattling around with no coherent and certainly no collaborative strategy to do this across successive governments. And so one of the things going back further into the history has been that each time government changes, kind of the Indigenous people have to start again in making their case to the new Minister for Indigenous Affairs, and building those relationships. And so the idea would be that this, while a new government could make modifications, if it's working, why would they? And secondly, because it's in their interest to make it work. And so there would be more continuity. We have elections only every 3 years in Australia, so that can be a pretty short turnaround from one government to the next if that's how the politics goes. And so this is something that can take a longer term view than just the immediate government, and can work in some more constructive ways.
No, that's a good perspective. I want to potentially, and maybe this is dangerous territory that I want to verge into, but I want to be as fair as possible to the whole discourse, not just one part of the discourse. And I think it's fairly obvious, if you've seen Nathan's social media activity and some of the stuff that he's been working on the last little while, it's, Nathan is advocating for a yes vote. And, we shouldn't be, that is what it is. And I had an opportunity to speak to Pastor Luke Stewart, who is Indigenous himself. He's Indigenous and Maori, which is a super cool combination. But he's the director for ATSIM in South Queensland Conference. And another shameless plug, I've already plugged Record Live. So if you want to listen to my other podcast, Signs of the Times Radio, then you can go and listen to that episode with Pastor Luke. He advocates for a yes vote as well, but he also, and I think interestingly, as a Indigenous person, showed a lot of empathy in our conversation and in subsequent conversations that I've had with him since, about people who are genuinely concerned, whether that's through reading or listening or watching misinformation or their political leanings. But I want to, I guess, give a little bit of credibility and credence to the whole discourse. So with that in mind, Nathan, is there credibility or is there a case for the no vote? I hope you don't mind me sort of mentioning you. You just said before we turned on the recording that you don't mind somebody voting no, but it's got to be for the right reasons, not for a dumb reason. So maybe that is the place to start. Is there a good reason to say no? And if there is, what are those reasons?
Well, firstly, one of the sillinesses of a referendum is that you take a really complicated issue or a really complicated set of issues. You take 250 years of national history. You take all these other competing interests and influences, and you condense them down into a single yes-no question. That's going to be a gross simplification of the issue. So they're really, you can object to it in so many different ways. Either way, wherever you might lean into it, you can say, well, this is a pretty simplistic a way to approach these issues. But that's where we've got to remember that we're actually not solving all our Indigenous issues. We're voting on changing a boring old constitution. That's what we're doing. And so that actually is a yes-no question. And so many other of the issues are beyond the scope of a referendum question, and they need to be addressed in those other ways before or after the referendum. But we're not going to solve them that day writing that's yes or no on the ballot paper. And so what we're doing in voting yes or no is simply voting about changing the wording in a very obscure document that most Australians have never read. And that's a really challenging thing, to take all this complexity and boil it down to something as basic as that. So there are, I guess, one of my frustrations, and I think many people have seen these frustrations, is how poorly the public debate has been handled, particularly in the last weeks and months this year. One of the things that I see as so frustrating in this situation is simply that this has been a bipartisan project, as in supported by both major political parties for most of its life. And most of the work was done under the previous coalition government. And with the change of government after the election, the current government said, well, let's do something about this. And up until just a few months ago, this was a bipartisan project simply to do something better for our Indigenous people in Australia. And then, as an act, I would describe it of political betrayal and political opportunism, a stunt, a chance to try and score a political point. The party that is the opposition party at the moment, basically threw all their Indigenous people under the bus and and said, we're going to oppose this, even though it's something that they've done most of the work on. And that's why the Shadow Indigenous Affairs spokesperson quit the day that happened, and their previous Minister for Indigenous Affairs quit the party at the same time. So this shouldn't be a debate. It should be, and this is one of the reasons why the Yes campaign has actually struggled so much this year, is because the negotiations all happened last year. All the discussions and planning was put in place for this to be a bipartisan project. We would all get together and celebrate how important our Indigenous peoples were to our identity and history and culture. And so that's one of the really messy things in this situation, is that it's more about politics than it is about Indigenous issues and certainly about Indigenous peoples. However, there are cases to be made for asking questions about it, and there is a radical no case, which is simply that this will actually this isn't good enough. Even that trying to shoehorn Indigenous peoples into a white colonialist constitution is actually a diminishment of Indigenous peoples, because they have their own sovereignty and they should be outside and beyond the Australian Constitution. That's the kind of the radical no. Then there's a kind of a no. Will this actually change anything? It's largely symbolic. We're going through all this trouble and all this trauma and all this stress. Is it actually going to change anything in the real world of a remote community? So that I think there's legitimate questions to be asked there. And that's, I actually believe there's an importance in symbolism, and any good Adventist who's been to a Revelation seminar knows the importance of symbolism. So we actually believe in symbolism. But beyond that, there are questions, I think legitimate questions about, I think there's a lack of understanding about treating disadvantaged peoples unequally, that kind of thing, that we'd be divided by race in that kind of way, that one group gets privileges that others don't. I think that's largely a misunderstanding, both misunderstanding of law and ethics. The last big research project I did in my law degree many years ago was on the rightness and appropriateness of positive discrimination to help people with chronic disadvantage, people groups. And particularly, I was talking in that context of Indigenous land rights, and just why that actually makes sense, why that's the right and good thing to do. But I do think that there are, getting to looking at some of the, so we get to the actual no case. After all of that, we get to what is the no case, and you look at the official referendum booklet that was distributed to every Australian home, sets out the yes case and the no case. And to be honest, I think there is a better no case than something bad might happen. And, that seems to be kind of the core argument that is made there. And I've read critiques of the no case in that booklet that just says, hey, Australia actually deserves a better argument for no than this. And that we don't, that there are better ways to address the issue, that there are other things we should be doing. And I actually agree with those things. I think there are other things we should be doing. But this is one thing that we can do now, one very simple, perhaps small thing that we can do in this particular moment to take a step in the right direction. So to be honest, I struggle with what the no case is beyond that, other than conspiracy theories, ignorance, confusion, and fear. I just don't find a strong rational case for no. And I'm sympathetic with people that think that it doesn't go far enough, but then I turn around and say, well, look at the trouble we're having even just going as far as this is, which isn't very far. And I'm sympathetic to those who are concerned about, where it might lead because they don't have the information of what is actually proposed. One of the questions that has often been raised in the last few months is simply we don't have much detail on what this would actually mean. What would the voice look like? How would it function? The reality is there's a 271-page document that sets out the design principles for the voice. Now, that's kind of hard to peddle in public because the more details you put there, the more it will be criticised. And the research that came out just a couple of weeks ago is that only 15% of Australia's population have read the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which is a single page, controversially, but 271 pages is probably a little bit beyond most of us, and I haven't read all those 271 pages. But if you simply Google voice design principles, you will find a summary of that, of what it is intended to be. But this also misunderstands the nature of what a constitution is. And if you go to section 51 of the Constitution, there are 39 heads of power that are set out that the government can make laws about. And it simply says, the Parliament of Australia can make laws for the peace, order and good governance of the Commonwealth. And then number 1, this. Number 2, this. And most of these are only 2 or 3 words. Some of them a single word. I think it's number 21 that simply says marriage. And so based on that one word, there's a whole raft of, marriage laws about who can marry and what marriage is, and family courts and all of these kind of things based on a single word. And so there's actually more detail in the Constitution, leaving the actual, more detail in the constitutional amendment, leaving the actual details of the voice and what it will be to the Parliament of the day, because one of the things, it's hard to change the Constitution, and so you can't put all those details in and recognise that in 20 years or 50 years' time, it might have to operate a little bit differently. So all of this stuff is complicated, and that, one of the things I think that we've seen in this situation, in this community debate, however you want to talk about it, is simply that it's hard to talk about complicated things when you struggle to get people's attention and when it's not a high priority in a lot of people's thinking.
It kind of needs to be like, what's the word? Like like you're saying, not too specific, because it just needs to be able to be flexible enough to be able to function for the time. But so many people have taken that unspecific. I can't even. What's the word? Specificity. I can't say it.
Specificity.
Unspecificness. That's the word. I was like, I can do it. I could hear it in my head, but I couldn't say it. People have taken that and just run with it, which is like kind of wild, because they haven't done that with any other part of the Constitution, which is, it's been interesting to see. And I try and be, I guess this is, as a pastor, you obviously you got to be accepting of everybody, no matter their views or political alignment or anything like that. And that's part of our church too. Our church is made of a very diverse group of 20-something million people. Like, that's just who we are, from all different places of the world. And so it's been interesting to see some of this discourse taking place, like both on the media, but both even just in our churches. So I guess one thing I'm kind of interested in, we've got a little bit of time left, and you have touched on this already, but I think, like, what would you say, I guess, like, if you could outline a bit of like the intersection between like your faith or like your Adventist understanding and worldview, and like how it's making, I guess, how it's informing you in this issue, and how you see see this? Because I think that's what a lot of people would, I don't know. I'm curious about that, because just hearing so many people's how faith has impacted how they view certain political whatevers.
And I think that's what we can do, because it's not just recycling what other people are talking about. What is it uniquely that our faith brings to a discussion like this? And I have three points, as any good rant should have. I mean, sermon. First one is that in the 1890s, Adventists were very involved in helping shape the Australian Constitution. And that's something that is sometimes forgotten, but is actually recognised in academics who study Australian constitutional history, is that but for Adventists, Section 116 of the Australian Constitution wouldn't be there. And Section 116 talks about freedom of religion. And that, of course, has been historically a really strong Adventist focus. And the story goes back to Kellyville, 1897, and a couple of guys were picked up for farming on Sunday. They were doing work outside on their property on Sunday, and they got arrested. One of them was fined. The other one was sentenced to the stocks. And the only reason he wasn't put in the stocks is because they couldn't find any stocks in Sydney in 1897. But knowing that the constitutional debates were going on at that time, the Adventists of those days, there was about 2,000 Adventists in Australia at that time, said, hey, we want to make sure that this isn't a religious constitution. We don't want there to be religious laws that might cause our persecution or make it hard for us to practice or share our faith in the future. And so a lot of the churches at the time were pushing for something in the preamble to the Constitution talking about how Australia was set up by the power of Almighty God or something like that, as a lot of those old documents tended to do. And so the Adventists set up this campaign. They were involved with public meetings. They collected signatures on a petition. They even started a magazine that ran for about 3 years, the Southern Sentinel of Religious Liberty or something like that. That was all focused on this campaign to make sure that the Australian Constitution is secular. And they kind of failed because God is in the preamble, but they succeeded with Section 116, which set up this situation of making this case where the government can't outlaw religion, the government can't set up or establish religion, and that religious adherence cannot be a qualification for basically jobs in the federal government. So three kind of prongs to it. And so the remarkable thing is that because Adventists were so against religion being in the Constitution and faith being involved in politics, they faithfully got very political. For 2,000 church members, they collected 7,000 signatures for this particular petition, and obviously had this influence in shaping what would be considered. It's really the one thing that is a human right that is directly recognised in Australia's Constitution. And that was the Adventist contribution. So I think there's something in looking at our constitutional history, we can say, well, actually, we should be involved in shaping this for good. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, when we go back to look at the silence of the Constitution in relation to our Indigenous people, and even the fact that they weren't recognised legally as being part of Australia or pre-existing in Australia, that goes back to the 15th century and some papal decrees where the European powers were theologically empowered to go out and colonise the world. And basically, where there weren't Christians, they could take their lands, enslave the people, and exploit everything and everybody as much as they wanted. And the language that was used there was the Latin terra nullius, that it's an empty land if there aren't Christians and their definition of civilization there when the European colonizers arrived. And so that is the theological assumption that underlies the silence of our Constitution. So I actually think from an Adventist perspective, we can look at that and say, we have a contribution to make here because we believe that every person is created in the image of God, that this was a theological heresy of the past. We've looked at other issues from the historic church and said we need to set these right. So the doctrine of discovery is something that we need to address. And we need to say, well, there's some reformation work to be done here. What could we do about it? And one of the things we can do about it is actually help to amend a historic silence and a historic wrong that is part of the legal framework of our country. And then I think the third thing is simply that when I was spending some time earlier in the year working on this and developing some documents around it, and there was a series of articles that was published in Record based on the work that I did at that time, I was reading through the Uluru Statement from the Heart and looking at how it describes the chronic disadvantage of our Indigenous people, and it talked about, health and incarceration, the breakdown of communities, and it just so struck me that when you read Jesus' first sermon in Luke chapter 4, where he got up and he said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor, to release the captives, to set the oppressed free, to heal the blind." All of those things are almost echoed very directly in the disadvantage of our Indigenous peoples. And so when we see that even they are almost using that similar language to talk about, these are the things that are plaguing our community. These are the things that we're asking for assistance and a voice to be able to step up on and to address. Our response with listening, with respect, responding with compassion, and even standing up for justice, it all gets to me to the point of saying, well, this should be a simple, straightforward thing for us to be able to reflect upon, to do the work, to answer some of the questions and fears that we might have, to sit down and listen to some well-informed people talking about these things, to do the reading, to go back and have a look at the Constitution and celebrate Section 116, but actually look at how the Constitution works and where we fit. And I recognise that not all of us can do that, but to look for good sources that can be well-informed in these discussions, and to say, well, once again, to break it down to a really simple question and say, well, which of the two outcomes of this referendum do we think is more likely to move us a step towards greater justice for the Indigenous peoples of Australia? And I think that that's not a hard question, because yes is an opportunity for difference. And as some Indigenous voices that I've been working with have said, we know what no looks like. No is the status quo. Yes is an opportunity to work together towards something better and something different.
No, that's really good. I really appreciate that perspective, contextualizing our history and contextualizing this whole debate, because I think that it's so easy to get caught up in the rhetoric of the moment that completely ignores everything that's come before, to ignore the fact that, as you've already mentioned, that up until the last couple months or the last year, this has been a bipartisan project. This has not been a controversial thing.
Yes.
So I've really appreciated the contextualization in this whole issue, because I think that once, like for me at least, seeing all of this that we've discussed so far has really informed, like, what does the next step look like? And even if it is a no, I think that there's going to be a lot of work that needs to be done either way. And this has been going on for a long time, clearly.
And these issues, whichever way the vote goes, these issues aren't going away. We'll still have to look at them again on October 15 and October 15 next year. And so it will go. Like some of these, because they're so entrenched, because there's so much history to them, they're not going to be turned around quickly. And so whether we vote yes or no, the bigger picture should be, how can we continue to listen and to stand with and support our Indigenous peoples as an act of justice and compassion and solidarity? And then, whichever way we vote, it actually matters. And so work out why you want to vote whichever way you want to vote for good reasons. Not just, some really bad TikTok clips that seem terribly popular at the moment. But look for some good reasons and some good thinking. even the work that I did, I read a number of books that were simply about the Uluru Statement from the Heart and where it came from. That's the kind of work that I've put into it so that I can speak because I care about this issue. I have friends who are Indigenous people. I've had opportunities to work with them in different places. And that is why it matters to me. I also think that there's a real advantage to us as Australia, as a nation, to embrace our Indigenous culture and background more, and that Australia could be a richer, and both you guys have lived in New Zealand where it has much more engagement with its Indigenous culture. It's not, in New Zealand isn't paradise despite the hobbits, but it, there is something really strong in how the cultures are much more integrated there. And it gives us, New Zealand, a uniqueness that other countries don't have and that Australia doesn't have.
Yeah, the fact that the Treaty of Waitangi was signed such a long time ago in relative terms, I suppose, really, I think, speaks to even the cultural recognition of the time of what better relations between cultures, colonial powers and Indigenous cultures could look like. Maybe we'll get a treaty one day, maybe not. Either way, I mean, this is better than the status quo. So I suppose that's positive. Look, I recognize that we are out of time. So Josh, unless there's anything that you would like to touch on before we wrap up,
it just struck me. You mentioned, and I mean, we don't have to dive into this. I think it's just something I wanted to highlight. But you, I guess, highlighted the disadvantages that First Nations people have in terms of like education and incarceration and health, which these are issues that Adventists have always been passionate about. We're so passionate about education, about health. And so I guess I just want to encourage all of our listeners to, really prayerfully consider this. Listen, like what Nathan said, listen to good voices about it. And I don't know, I guess just continue praying for this. Like, I mean, it's just it just breaks my heart to see like the injustices that are in our nation. And I mean, this is what we want. We want a fair Australia. And so I guess, this is just such a big thing. And so let's continue praying for it. And I've really gotten a lot out of today's episode, Nathan. So thank you for all that you've brought, the history, the legal insights. It's been really cool. So thank you so much for your time and for everything you're doing.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. And I think praying for our country at this time is a really good thing to do. We've done a series of public events that I've been invited to be a part of in different parts of the country and have some still coming up. And we've finished each of those with simply getting in small groups and praying for our country, praying for our Indigenous peoples, and praying for our church and its response to this particular time and to these ongoing issues. And, if somebody needs something to pray for, that's something for the next few weeks to really turn your attention to.
Awesome. This has been such a treat. And thank you so much. Thanks for listening, everybody. And hey, let's I guess we'll see what happens. Awesome. Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Nathan. And everybody stay awesome, stay wonderful. That is Josh, Jesse, and Nathan out. Bye.